Hey, so we've got this challenge, right? We're talking about OOP. I've got class is a student, and then I have my initialization function here, four parameter self name enrolled alumni. Um, right, and just to be clear, what is happening if someone runs a line of code like this, right, and they're instantiating a student object, that's when this init function is run. And we can see that Chauncey is passed in for name, enrolled is passed in as a true, and alumni is passed in as true. For the three attributes of the object that come in as parameters, it's super straightforward, right? That my parameter name just gets assigned to this object, right? So we're talking, when we say self dot, we're talking about this object that we're initiating, this student object that's going to be called S, right? So we take the parameter and assign it to the name attribute of this object. And we do the same thing for enrolled and the same thing for alumni. And then we're given an if statement here. If enrolled is true and alumni is true, then continuing education is true, right? But what we see here is continuing education is also an attribute of this specific object, right? So this needs the self as well, right? So what's happening now is if I call this, and uh, if I were to actually print s dot is continuing ed, um, then what would happen is um, this would come back as true, right? Which is a nice start, but that's not everything that we're after. An issue that we're going to find is um, that we're not dealing with the case if these two things are not true. And I'm actually going to copy and paste this over. I've got a Jupyter notebook open. I just want to see, right? As I mentioned, right, this does return true. But if I change one of these to false, right, this condition is not going to be met. And self-continuing ed is never instantiated for this particular object, this object S. So what I'm guessing we're going to get back is a none type. And it actually says it doesn't even have that attribute. It doesn't even put in there a none by default, right? So what we would need to do is we need to deal with an else, right? And it being a Boolean, it can be pretty clear that we might just want to set this to false, um, right? And by doing that, right, we're making sure that this attribute, continuing ed, is being set regardless of the values for enrolled and alumni, right? So now, since both of these are not true, when I get continuing ed from this object, the attribute continuing ed as returned by the method is continuing ed, and I run this, um, and there is a typo. There it is. Right, I can now see that's false. Right, so if I have true, true, it'll return me true, right? Um, and if I have either one of them as false, it will return false, right? So, name of the game, or the most important thing to take away here, is that we first need to make sure that if we're setting an attribute, we're at least setting it in all cases, right? So, not some student objects have this attribute, other student objects don't have this attribute, right? If I wasn't willing to say that these people were continuing ed was false, maybe it's simply unknown, right? I might do none, right? And That way the attribute is there, it's just empty or NA or null, right? And I can see now it gives me that none. So that's a common way to set an attribute of an object that is unknown. You'll put like a none type object in there just as a placeholder, right? So we just need to make sure that if we're setting some attribute to an object, right, with self.attribute name, um, that it's going to be something is going to be assigned to it in every version of the object being instantiated. Um, so yeah, I think right take homes, right, always self dot, right, that means that we're working on this actual object S, and setting the name of S to this parameter, setting enrolled to this parameter, setting alumni to this parameter, and then based on those, right, determining whether or not they are in continuing ed. And when we determine that, we can set that attribute, right? And then finally, we can actually run this code and get that attribute. This type of method is a pretty common method that you'll see written into most object-oriented programming. Is it's called a getter, right? And it's actually not necessary in Python, because I can just straight up reference s.continuing ed, although it's not callable, so I'll get rid of my parentheses, right? But I can just call s.continuing ed, right? And if this is true, right, it'll return true. I can straight up call it. So I actually don't need this method, right? But in other languages, you'll do all sorts of getters, right? So I would do is enrolled, self, return self dot is our self dot enrolled, right? And then I would do def is alumni, self, return self dot alumni, right? So I can run these methods, right, using my object is alumni. For example, I do want the parentheses there because it's a method, right? And this returns whatever that is. Looks like it's the second one, right? So if I turn it to false, it's false, right? But again, these methods are actually not necessary in Python. In OOP, you can just use s.alumni and it'll give it back to you.